We have come now through the crucifixion. Jesus has been placed in the tomb, and we arrive at Saturday of Holy Week. What happened on Saturday? We know that Jesus is dead. We know he's been placed in a tomb. We know that tomb has been sealed. But what happened on Saturday? In Luke 23:56, Luke tells us, on the Sabbath, the disciples rested according to the commandments. So the disciples, as Jesus was laying in the tomb, were resting along with the rest of the Jewish people. And while that might seem like a small detail to add, it actually bears a lot of significance. And that's because the Sabbath was about more than just rest. The Sabbath was about remembrance. In Deuteronomy 5, Moses tells the people of God, yet again, to keep the Sabbath day. And why are they to do that? What's the reason Moses gives? He says, remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out. On the Sabbath day, as the people of Israel were resting from their work, they were to remember the great work of salvation that God had done for them. The Sabbath day was a time for rest and remembrance. The people were to remember that it was God's power that saved them, not their own. That it was God's plans that came true, not theirs. That God is the Savior. They are not. As they rested on the Sabbath, they were to remember the salvation of their God. So think about the significance of that for the disciples. It's Saturday of Holy Week. Jesus has just been put to death on the cross. The Romans nailed him there. The Jews put him there. And the disciples are resting on the Sabbath. Amidst all of the grief and despair and fear they must have been feeling on that terrible day, the disciples were being led to remember through the picture of the Sabbath the great salvation that God had worked for them as a people. Even as they were fighting with despair and fear, the disciples were being treated to a wonderful picture of who their God was and continued to be. And so on that Sabbath day, on that Saturday, the disciples were being tested. Their faith was being put to the test. Would they believe, despite all of the circumstances that are around them, despite what they saw the terrible day before, would they believe that God was still a saving God, that God was still powerful, and that through Jesus God was working a salvation? Would they believe that? Or would they give in to despair? It was a terrible day for them that Saturday, 2,000 years ago. But they were being taught to remember as they practiced the Sabbath, as they obeyed the commandment to rest. Would they believe? Would they believe in the salvation of God? We, as we sit here 2,000 years later, remembering that day as Jesus laid in the tomb, we can come to it with a different sort of rest. We can rest, not just remembering the salvation in Egypt, but remembering the salvation that God was about to work through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We can go to bed tonight and rest soundly knowing that our God worked his salvation, that his promises came true, that his power proved mighty. Not this time to save us from slavery in Egypt, but to save us from a greater enemy, death itself and slavery to sin. We can rest with a hope and an expectation of the morning because we know what happens when we wake up tomorrow. We know what we're going to celebrate tomorrow. We're going to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, the ultimate salvation. So go to bed tonight with a joy in your heart, knowing that as the disciples 2,000 years ago rested, remembering the salvation of their God, we can rest tonight remembering the salvation that God was about to work in the morning. We can rest because we know what comes tomorrow.